Welcome to Imperfect Momming. Our children are constantly looking to us for examples. The term role model doesn't quite cut it here. We are shaping their worldview with every move we make. You see, it's not in the lectures we give or moments where we are actively attempting to teach them. It's in the micro movements we make, the unconscious ways in which we navigate life. We are constantly teaching our children how to show up for themselves, their friends, their future partners, and even their future children. So what can we do to ensure we are raising thoughtful, compassionate, self-aware human beings? We have to become them ourselves. No one is perfect, but we can still all be better, and it starts with self-healing. Let's get to it. Welcome back to Imperfect Momming, and today we have a special guest, Kelly Irene, and welcome.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about who you are and your journey.
Yeah. So I'm Kelly Irene. I am mom to 2 girls and 1 cat. My kids are 9 and 11. I don't know what age they're going on because that changes from moment to moment. Sometimes my oldest will say, I wish I were 2 again so you could just hold me, which is so sweet. And then other times I'm pretty sure that they're already 16.
Right.
So, that really kind of does a number on you when you're like, I don't know how old you are right now. And then, like I said, we have a cat, and I am single mom, so have my kids 50% of the time, which is a journey in and of itself. I've been single for 4 years, and that's a big part of my parenting journey as well.
Awesome. And so I know that, or you know that our podcast is about parenting and the better person that you become, the better parent that you become. What part of that story would you like to share with us?
So we could start, for me, parenting did not come naturally. So as a child growing up, we could start there because I feel like that my own experience with my parents certainly plays into my early experience as a parent. My parents were really hands off. So if I wanted to go and do something with my dad, then I was really included. So if I wanted to go hunting with him or go fishing or go fix a roof with him, he was always happy to have me along. But there wasn't any kind of engagement in what I was doing. And then my mom was sick. She was sick a lot when I was a child, and she worked full time. So she was full time teacher. She was sick. She had 3 crazy daughters. And she was just like, okay, if you guys are surviving, I'm doing my job. And she did the best she could. So there's no hard feelings about that. But because of that, and I didn't babysit growing up. It just nurturing wasn't part of my early life experience. And so when I had my first daughter at 27, I didn't know what to do. And at that point, I was living with my then husband. He was going to seminary at a really conservative school where the women they stayed home. That's what you did. It wasn't questioned. Everybody couldn't wait to be a mom. And so I found myself completely lost in the middle of this place where I didn't know how to be a mom. It hadn't been modeled to me how to be involved. And so my 2 role models were either you're not involved at all, or you're home 24/7 and your number one priority 24/7 is your baby. And of course, babies need more than grown-up kids. But with that, I was just totally lost. And on top of that, I was in an abusive relationship. And so I used to sort of joke, sort of regret the fact that I didn't embrace being a mom until my oldest was probably 8. So that's 8 years of her life that I didn't know how to connect.
Yeah.
I didn't know how to accept me being myself as her mom. I didn't have the support that I needed from my husband, I had some support outside of our family unit, but not within it. So that is really kind of where I feel like my journey begins, is having started just not having a clue what to do.
And I'm really glad that you said that because I feel like, well, number one, our stories are very similar.
Hmm.
I know you were married to a pastor. My dad was a pastor.
Yep.
And
Yeah. Gosh.
my dad is very intellectual, and so he was very much in his books. And there was, he had interests outside of, the church, but they were not things that I was interested in, like baseball and basketball and football and
Yeah.
okay, sports. So um and then my mom was, the typical mom in the 80s and 90s, where she had the career and was doing all the housework and the cooking and the cleaning, and so the time that I really had with my mom, I was spending following her around the house, telling her about my day.
Hmm.
And, as the adult me, I look back and I'm like, well, I probably could have helped her with doing the laundry. But that wasn't my goal. My goal was she was my sounding board. And that's how she and I connected.
Yeah.
And, I had a lot of support outside of the house, but not in the house. And when, you know, I don't know that I would describe it the same way, but I think I have that same feeling of like, it didn't really come naturally to me. The baby years kind of did, but right around, I don't know, 14 months was when I left my husband. And so
Mhm.
everything kind of got real. Like, this is my life now, that taking care of this child
Yeah. myself,
and not really having somebody to bounce ideas off of, and just not knowing how to connect with this 14-month-old. And really, I would say, until we could have conversations, I didn't feel like I could really connect with him.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm glad that you brought that up, because if I experienced it and you experienced it, we're not the only ones. I
No,
mean,
we're not.
so go
And
ahead.
coming from that Christian background, I think that's kind of taboo to talk about, like not feeling that connection with your baby or with your child, because there's just so much of an expectation that, like, well, women are the moms, right? They stay home and take care of the kids.
And for 10 years, I said, I don't want children. Like, I
Yeah.
don't think that's something that my son actually knows. But I babysat so much, or I was at a Christian camp for, 7 out of the 9 weeks that they had kids. I was there as a
Okay.
counselor. And so
Yeah.
I was with kids for 7 out of the 9 weeks of my summer. And I was like, okay, I'm done. I don't want to, want to be around kids anymore.
Yeah.
And for 10 years, I was that way. And then, my biological clock kicked in, and the rest is history. So,
I was kind of the opposite end of that, where like I was like, oh, we've been married for 3 years. I guess we're supposed to have kids, so let's do it.
mhm, yeah. So when
Yeah.
did things really start changing for you?
So for me, leaving my husband was also a catalyst to that, in terms of my story. So my oldest was 7, my youngest was 4, going on 5, or maybe 6. Anyway, I don't remember the exact ages, but they were around, yeah, 5 and 7 when I filed for divorce. And that was like the first of many steps in like reclaiming myself and discovering who I am.
Mm,
So it was through that discovery of me that I started to realize, oh, I am actually a good mom. Like,
mm,
I haven't always known what I'm doing, but I have, been there when one of my kids went through, like, we got to a point where we had to go to Stanford to get a bunch of assessments done because she was having so many challenges.
mm,
And like, I was the one who advocated relentlessly for her for that for a year. And at one point they were in a daycare that I remember like sitting on the phone after dropping the girls off, calling my sister and just in tears, because I was so afraid that I would go back that afternoon and my kids wouldn't be there.
mm,
And there, that is like a whole other story. And it turned out that that was actually a really bad place for them to be. And some things happened there that shouldn't have.
Mhm.
But it was, it was those kinds of things that I was able to look back on and say, okay, I had that intuition, and eventually I listened to it and I pulled them out. And, I was the advocate. I didn't always know what I was doing, but I did the best I could with what I had. And so there was still a lot of like guilt and shame for all of the time I didn't know how to connect, and for what I felt like had been damage done to my kids because I didn't know how to connect with them. But as I began to know myself better, I really began to see like, okay, I am a good mom. I'm not perfect. I can be better. And then from there, I really was able to begin the process of like building a truly deep relationship with my kids.
Yeah. What are some of the things, like if one of our, listeners is in that place where she
Yeah.
doesn't know herself, but she feels like something's off, and like what kind of things were you doing to really figure out who you were?
Yeah. There's so many things.
Yeah.
I would say therapy is a huge piece of that, right? I've been through multiple therapists, and not because there was anything wrong with them, but just in each season, I've needed a different therapist to help me with
Yeah.
whatever I've been working through. So, one, if you're able to get connected with a therapist, specifically somebody who, if you are in an abusive relationship or have been, specifically with a therapist who has experience and education in abusive trauma or religious trauma, if you're coming out of a religious context. For me, journaling has been huge. I journaled all through my marriage, all through the leaving. And I just got very real with myself. And it was just in those moments of being able to see, like, sometimes I would look back and go, okay, here's what I wrote 6 months ago.
Mm.
And just leaving space for myself to do that. There have been times where I've literally had to like hold myself and recognize that the anxiety that I have, or the fear or the anger, is valid.
Mhm.
And, whether that comes from simple parenting because it's just hard, or from being in a really difficult relationship or other context, making space to feel your feelings is so important and also really scary. But I think that those are like some of the really foundational things. And if you want to go into, some of the other things, I'm happy to. But those for me, like I would say it really came down to therapy and journaling as like my first two.
Yeah, I think that those are really good. I I've never been much of a journaler,
Hmm.
and I think that there was at some point I decided that everybody was watching me, and
Mm.
I think that, my dad being a pastor is a huge part of that, is that, and I would imagine,
100%.
yeah,
Yes.
and I would imagine as a pastor's wife,
Yeah.
um, that feeling transfers over too. And so
Yeah.
there was a big part of me that was always afraid of what if somebody reads my journal. And I'm not trying
Yeah.
to discourage anybody from
Right.
writing
But
in
I
a
think a lot
journal.
of people feel that way.
Yeah. And what I'm learning is I have a couple of writer friends that both of them destroyed their journals at one point because they were afraid of that.
Hmm.
So eh, like I am part of a writing group, and there's a National Novel Writing Month. NaNoWriMo is it's been around since at least since 2008, I think, was the
Okay.
first time I participated in it. Um, and my friend, who's also a writing coach, she recommended that we write a letter to ourselves at the end, to read at the end of November.
Oh,
And I remember writing the letter to myself. And then when it came time to reading the letter, I didn't remember what it said.
yeah.
And when it was time to read the letter, I was terrified of what I was going to be reading. And I was a lot nicer to myself than I thought I was going to
Yeah.
be. Or
Yeah.
it didn't produce the same the emotion that I was afraid of it producing,
Mm.
which was amazing. And I think that that's a big reason that people don't journal, because they're afraid of the emotions that they're
Yeah.
feeling.
Yep.
But when you allow yourself to feel the emotions, they do go away. They're
Yes.
like, my life coach has a phrase that he loves to say that, and I think it came from a book, that emotions buried alive never die. And so if you have an emotion in your body and you don't express that emotion, where does it go? It just stays in your body, and then it builds up, and then you're flipping people off in traffic,
Yes, it's true. I have done that.
Yeah, I did that the other day. Well, I didn't flip him off, but I laid on the horn pretty good because he almost ran into my car, and I was not happy about that.
No, who would be? I love that idea of writing a letter to yourself. And I think maybe that's helpful, is talking about like some actual journaling practices for people who aren't journalers or who don't consider themselves journalers. So if there's a specific memory that you have that keeps coming back up, something really helpful to do is write a letter to your past self. To, if it was something that happened when you were 13 or 20 or whatever age it was, write a letter to yourself just saying all the things that you needed to hear, or write a letter to your future self, or pretend like you're 80 looking back at your life and writing to yourself now, and writing all the things that you are so glad that you're doing now in your life. So I think those kind of letters can be incredibly helpful.
I completely agree, especially the 80-year-old one, because what that does is it really helps you focus on your priorities and the things that are important to you, because your 80-year-old self, if you're thinking from her perspective, you're thinking, I'm so glad you helped so many people so many women in their lives. Like that's what my 80-year-old self would say to me. It's like, and I know that that's important to me. And so you can get some clarity about what you want to do with your life. My son had gone to a program for early intervention for autism.
Okay.
And they weren't great at working with children who are as high functioning as he is. Okay. And so they had the skills for not so high functioning, but they didn't have the skills for where he was on the spectrum.
Yeah.
And you laugh like you have some experience in
I
that.
have some experience with that. Like our stories really are so similar.
They are very similar, yes.
Yeah.
So inside that program, there was one of the things that they do is they figure out gaps in your knowledge, and then they ask you questions and try to fill the gaps in the knowledge. I guess I didn't understand the process. I just kind of went with it. He would get so annoyed with the same questions being asked over and over again, because they didn't tell him he was getting them wrong. So he's thinking he's getting them right, and they're just asking the same questions over and over again. Yeah. So that was very triggering for him, that they would keep asking the same questions over and over. And then they would put him in this padded room because he was, I guess, being aggressive to the ABA person. And so then he'd be in the room, he'd calm down, they'd pull him out of the room, and then he'd get re-triggered and they'd put him back in the room. So all of this happening, I didn't know that it was happening as much as it was. Yeah. And once I found out, I pulled him.
Yeah.
So he remembers a lot of this. He had a lot of pent up emotion from this. And every time it would come up in some way, shape, or form, we would talk about asking questions or just talk about the place in general. And he would get angry, just so angry.
Yeah.
So finally, I'm trained as a life coach, and there's this method called Gestalt, and you basically talk to someone who's not there. So he can talk to me and pretend that I'm the people from the center. And so I told him, pretend that they're here and say to them anything that you want to say to them, including cuss words, because I don't care if he's 8 years old and it's in his body. He knows cuss words exist. It's in his body. If he wants to say it, I'm not going to get him in trouble for that in this moment.
Yeah.
You have permission. Get the emotion out. And he spent about 5 minutes yelling and cussing at them. And ever since that moment, he hasn't had the same energy about talking about them.
Wow.
And then 2 days ago, he said he pulled a shirt from the closet that was in there and he put it on and it had their name on it. And he said, you know what? I forgive them.
Wow.
And I said, wow, that's really awesome that you forgive them. And he said, yeah, it would be easier if they would apologize to me. But
100%.
right. And I said, that actually is a sign of maturity, that you could forgive somebody that didn't apologize to you.
Yeah, that's so powerful.
So I tell that story as this is like proof and evidence that when we hold emotion in our body, that it just sits there and it eats away at us, and it creates more emotions that are attached to that, and it makes those emotions bigger and scarier. But if we just acknowledge the emotion and it'll release on its own. It doesn't want to be in our body. It wants to be out.
Yeah, I think that that's so helpful. And that's one where, whether it's writing or talking to yourself or talking to another person, being able to go back and express those things that you couldn't express in the moment can be so powerful. When I was leaving my husband, one of the things that I did is I actually went back through some of the stories that I had told where I felt like I had been protecting him at my own cost. And, being a pastor's wife, I was really, really good at that. I excelled at making him look good. I was really good at my job. But there came a point where I realized, like, this is actually doing a lot of harm to me and to my kids because I can't be there for them. So I went back and wrote those stories without protecting him. And that was so powerful to me because all of a sudden it was like this anger that I had built up in my body because I hadn't been able to address those things was able to make itself known and eventually release. But I was also able to say, oh my gosh, I'm not the problem in this. Like, do fights take two? 100%. But when you're in an abusive relationship, one of the hallmarks is you as the victim become blamed. You get blamed for all the problems. So that was really helpful for me too. But again, that was writing. And some of that did translate into talking to a very good friend of mine who was able to say, hey, Kelly, you should check out the cycle of abuse. And because at that point, I still didn't know that I was in an abusive relationship. So she had helped me with that. But I think, sometimes writing, if you have something specific to focus on versus just sitting down to a blank page where you're like, I don't know what to put on here, can be really helpful.
Yeah. And my friend is developing some questions that help people tell their story. Cool. I wish it was done so I could plug her real quick, but
yeah. So one of the things that has really helped me recently is I have a podcast called Most True You. And in that I've begun to tell my story as well as make space for other people's stories. And within that, like kind of my next step is developing some of those like journal prompts as well as integrating oracle cards with it, because that has also been a big part of my healing journey that has, again, contributing to my ability to parent better.
Yeah. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. You and your husband were doing a support group for abused women. Did you not want to talk about that?
Oh, no, let's talk about this. I'm here all day long to talk about this because, like I said, I was in a 10-year marriage, abusive marriage, and I didn't know that it was abusive. Like, I just didn't. I was unhappy, but I had no idea that it was abusive. What was it? Like 4 months before I left, we hosted at our church this so we were part of a denomination, and in that denomination, they have what's called advocates for victims of abuse. And they had somebody come out to our church, and it was a whole weekend long thing about how you could be an advocate for people who, for victims of abuse. And he's like interviewing the couple that's leading it on stage. We've invited churches from all around the region to be there. He like the whole thing is us putting this on. We hosted them in our house, and the whole time, like, he was actively doing things to like keep me silent, to keep me separated from them.
Wow.
And I didn't realize it until after that, like, of course he didn't want me talking to them. Of course he didn't want me to, have any one-on-one time with them, because that could have been devastating for him.
Yeah.
It didn't help him in the long run, but yeah, I mean, it's things like that, that like you can be in an abusive relationship and just not know it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a piece of advice that you want to share with our moms listening?
I mean, number one, I would say trust your intuition, and whether that is something that you feel in your gut, in your heart, in your mind, like honor that and learn to start listening to her, because she's been talking to you probably all along, but the more you listen, the better off you're going to be. So that would be number one. And then the other thing I think would be, I have learned to put connection with my kids above everything else. And that has just night and day changed our relationship.
Yeah.
It's changed. It's changed everything for me. So learning to really connect with my kids is something that I like. If I could give that to every mom, I would.
I agree completely. Yeah. Is there a book that has been impactful?
So one that I really love is called I Love You Rituals. And I don't remember the name of the author, but my kiddos still, I mean, to this day, we use our I Love You rituals. And so the book kind of goes through, what are I Love You rituals? How can they be used, whether it's in a childcare setting, parenting, whatever relationship. And then it gives you really practical tips. And then anything by Daniel Siegel, like he's
Right.
just incredible.
He's my favorite. I think we talk about him all the time, every episode.
Oh my God, you can't go wrong. The Whole Brain Child, right. No Trauma Discipline. Those are fantastic books to just kind of, especially like for me, they helped because I came from the opposite side of like when my girls were born, people were gifting me copies of Baby Wise. And, they're talking about how manipulative babies are and how you just have to let them cry it out. And it's terrible, terrible advice. It's so harmful, but it exists and it's out there. So I think that those books, I would highly recommend any of his.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's one that he wrote that's called Parenting from the Inside Out.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
And one of my guests does a deep dive book club on it.
Okay.
And I mean, it's like a chapter every 2 weeks or something like that because of how deep that they go into it.
Intense.
Yeah. And she said, I was explaining something that I do whenever I lose my mind.
Yeah.
Whenever I lose my temper. Yeah. Whenever I lose my temper with my son, I always like, especially if it's something that's constantly happening, I stop and I analyze like, okay, what was the trigger? What created the situation for him? What created the situation for me? And how can we change that? And she goes, oh, you perfectly described what they talk about. And she named it. And I was like, I don't think I've perfectly described anything ever.
Congratulations.
And I haven't read the book yet. I just was doing that because it's something that's important to me that I realize, I know I'm human. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to lose my temper. And there's things that you can do to not lose your temper. Like self-care is something, and understanding what triggers your thoughts and triggers your reactions. 'Cause we're habit creatures. And at one point I was actually able to pinpoint the thought that created the emotion that created the action. I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I haven't done that in a while, but I also haven't needed it in a while. But so there so much, I learned this inside my current relationship, that when someone is emotionally active, especially if it's me, It's better to walk away and calm and then come back instead of having that reaction, because having the reaction is damaging to any relationship. It just it's a little chink in the armor, and you know, you want to have as few of those, especially with your kids, as possible. So gosh. So where can our listeners find you? You mentioned you have a podcast.
I have a podcast called Most True You, and that's on most of the main podcasting platforms, including iTunes and Spotify. So mosttrueyoupodcast.com or ikellyirene.com. Both of those really will take you to the same place. But that's where you can find out more about me, listen to the podcast. And if my story resonates, I would love to know that.
Absolutely. And I'm going to be a guest soon too.
Yes, I'm excited for that.
Well, I want to thank you, Kelly, for coming today, and thank the listeners for listening today. And I think I'm still supposed to say, you know, do all the things of like and subscribe and and
leave a good review
and and tell everybody how much you loved Kelly and all those kind of fun things. And we will talk to you next week. You, the listeners, you, the plural, the general you. And until then, keep healing.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Imperfect Momming. It's time for us to step up and realize that our power is not in trying to shape our children. Our power lies in shaping ourselves into the people we want our children to model themselves after. Don't just do it for your kids. Do it for yourself. When you become a more self-aware, compassionate, and confident person, you and everyone around you benefit. For more information about me and my work, visit AlysiaLyons.com. That's AlysiaLyons.com. See you next time.